मानुषी संवाद में आप सबका स्वागत है. Welcome to the 27th December 2022 edition of Manushi Samvad. Friends, today we have a very contentious topic. और इस टॉपिक पर बात करने के लिए हिंदुस्तान में तो एक्सपर्ट्स मिलते ही नहीं हैं. बहुत डरे हुए हैं लोग इस पे बात करने को, क्योंकि इंटरनेशनल माहौल इतना डरावना बना दिया है. आपको स्ट्राइक डाउन कर देंगे, आपको आपकी चैनल उड़वा देंगे, परंतु इसको हम इग्नोर भी नहीं कर सकते. और क्योंकि ये प्रोटेस्ट हिंदुस्तान में भले ही अभी प्रोटेस्ट ना शुरू हो, और हो सकता है अभी डेटा लोग इकट्ठा कर रहे हैं, इसको रिव्यू कर रहे हैं, और हमारी इंडिया की वैक्सीन भी अलग ही थी, हमारी बनाई थी, उसका असेसमेंट जब तक होगा सो होगा. परंतु जो वेस्ट में वैक्सीन बनाई गई, the vaccines that have been administered in Western countries, in Europe, in America, etc., have created a huge backlash, and very senior scientists have been protesting against the scam that was COVID, and a bigger scam that is the entire universal vaccination campaign, which was imposed on people whether they wanted it or not. This is the first time in the history of humankind that people have been administered forcibly through many coercive methods a vaccine for a disease which they may or may never get in their entire life, even if they are asymptomatic, even if they have no symptoms, even if they are perfectly healthy, even then they've been forced to take the vaccine. And the results in the West have been very, very worrisome, very disastrous. So, to discuss this issue and to give us an update on what's happening, we have with us Carpentier. He spends half his time in India and the other half in Paris and keeps track of both the worlds. And thank you, for joining us on this very contentious topic. As I said, not many people dare talk about it openly. I'm so glad you are willing to give our viewers a good summary of what's happening. But before we start, I'd like to read out this small quotation from Robert Kennedy, which I just posted on my Twitter handle. He says, Dr. Anthony Fauci will soon retire from NIH after 50-year reign as one of history's most despotic and dangerous predators. While Fauci may be stepping down, Children's Health Defense is stepping up campaign to hold him and government agencies he commandeered and corrupted accountable. Robert Kennedy. And I've been getting regular mails from Children's Health Defense Group from America talking about this issue. But its implications are, of course, particularly dangerous for children because they are yet to develop a healthy body. They are in the process and you're destroying it at a very early age. But obviously, all that Robert Kennedy and so many other scientists have been talking about has implications for the entire humanity. So, welcome, to this show.
Namaste, Madhuji. Nice to see you again.
Yes.
I know that I listened to your talk with Dr. Rainer Fulmich from Germany, who was one of the early whistleblowers on what was happening with vaccination. So I know you have had guts to take up this story and follow it.
No, I've had 5 other programs on the subject, some with Indian experts also, but some of those experts, including lawyers, have sort of gone quiet. So we don't really know what's happening in India. but at least global picture we can talk about, since facts about India are yet to kind of get consolidated. But before we start, viewers, please do your bit, do like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And this is going to be an important subject for you to listen to carefully and share with others who you care for. लाइक कीजिए, कमेंट कीजिए, शेयर कीजिए, सब्सक्राइब कीजिए और सपोर्ट भी कीजिए थोड़ा बहुत अपनी यथासंभव अ, हैसियत के अनुसार. चलिए, सो कॉम, all yours. Tell me, first let's have an overview of where things stand.
First, one has to refer to the recent disclosures from Twitter, which were organized by the new owner, Elon Musk. And he revealed some very compromising and very alarming facts about the US government's interference with the Twitter and its actual use of corruption to make sure that any news or any information or report that was not convergent with the government, US government line with regard to COVID and vaccines was censored, edited, and this was an agreement that was negotiated with the FBI, apparently. And we also have evidence through Twitter's disclosures of many other forms of interference with public opinion, including, for example, on the war with Ukraine, on which the information is carefully edited to make sure that only positive news are brought out about Ukraine and only negative news about Russia. So whatever we think of the war, I think the public in a democratic country should be entitled to fair and accurate information and not to government propaganda, which brings us back to the days of the Cold War or even of World War II. Now, back to COVID. You know, I was always impressed with the vast number of scientists and physicians who, right from the first days of the epidemic, were looking at critically at government policies, particularly in the Western so-called rich countries, and who were also very concerned that usual health protocols were being broken and violated for a particular purpose, which was clearly a campaign to bring about universal vaccination. Now, this attracted a lot of misgivings. And here I am not speaking on my own behalf because I do not have the medical authority to do so, but I'm simply reporting on what a number of very eminent specialists, including Robert Malone, who is one of the co-inventors of the mRNA technology, and many others, including Dr. Van den Bosch from Belgium, Dr. Joseph Trito, president of the World Academy of Biological Sciences and Technologies, whom I personally interviewed online about a year ago. And then, of course, I can mention about 20 other world-renowned specialists. And apart from them, you have thousands of physicians who were also protesting right from day one, even if quietly, the fact that they had been told not to treat the patients with any of the usual remedies used against certain forms of flu. And obviously, we all know that COVID viruses are all flu-related. Then there was very early on this talk that you needed a vaccination. And this also brought out a lot of misgivings because most of the specialists, and again, I'm referring to them, always knew that pulmonary infections cannot really be vaccinated against. So vaccines have not been historically successful. And therefore, the question was, why would such a new vaccine be successful? On top of that, what's very interesting is that most of the protocols that have been agreed upon at various levels about how to treat epidemics, such as, in fact, COVID, all those treatments were basically they were part of policies, and I can quote the report presented to the French Senate 4 years ago, in which it was already established that in case of an epidemic, there was no need for mask wearing. Universal confinement should not be imposed. Only people who are fragile or sick should be isolated. And it was very important not to overwhelm hospitals, but to give people anti-inflammatories and a number of other very naturally occurring medicines, such as zinc, which would easily prevent the epidemic from becoming grave in most cases. And it was also known, it became known fairly early, that COVID-19 would only be lethal or very dangerous for people in very weak states of health and immunity, or for people who are over 75. So why is it that all these agreements, all those measures were overturned in the course of a few months, and the exactly opposite measures were imposed? Universal mask wearing, compulsory confinement for everybody, and of course, as Trump put it, a race to vaccination without going through the usual testing protocols, which take several years. Instead of that, there was a warp speed concept. And we can see that behind all those very unusual remedies, there were 2 or 3 factors. One of them was definitely the Chinese policy, because we all know now that in the early stage of the epidemic in China, Dr. Fauci got reports from the Chinese about their confining an entire province, and then essentially the entire country. And he somehow came to believe that this was the right thing to do, and it should be imposed in the US and in the rest of the world as well. Then he had been saying for many months that there was no need for mask wearing because it had no effect. And then at some point, he changed his mind and decided that mask was good. If you hear Fauci over the last 2 years, you find that he practically said everything and the opposite of everything. So clearly, he was either ignorant or he was just following certain guidelines that came from somewhere else. The other factor was, of course, the WHO. And we know that the WHO is under 2 major influences, one being China and the other being the Gates Foundation. And somehow in Bill Gates, we have a very unusual billionaire who is really not active in his own business for the last 10, 15 years. He has practically let go of it, except of course for the shares. And he had to find something to do. And Bill Gates, being known as an instinctive monopolist, he was trying to monopolize another sector which fascinated him, which was the health sector. His own belief is that the human population has become far too large, and there have to be effective ways to reduce it. And of course, he always speaks about the need for health remedies, as he put it, the final solution. And of course, he often said that if you bring adequate vaccines, especially in places like Africa and India, you can also reduce the population, although it was not entirely clear how the two were connected. So Bill Gates had said in an interview, which was published in George magazine. I don't know if you remember George. George was published by John F. Kennedy Jr. And it was alive as long as John Kennedy was alive. Then, as you know, he died in a mysterious plane crash at sea somewhere. But anyway, John Kennedy published a cover interview of Bill Gates. It must have been about 20 years ago. And Bill Gates then spoke about the fact that humanity would be faced with a major pulmonary infection, which would basically make most people unable to breathe. And vaccines had to be found to prevent it. Now, we don't know why Bill Gates thought that this was one of the most urgent problems that would confront humanity, but that's what he said, and which was published. So then, when we see COVID happening, we know that very early on, Bill Gates was among those who predicted that it would happen and that it would be a pandemic, and that the whole world would have to come together under the authority of the WHO. And meanwhile, Bill Gates had invested heavily in the major vaccine manufacturers. Then, of course, you can see very quickly how there were these major alliances that were formed between vaccine manufacturers, major consulting agencies, especially McKinsey International, and certain government entities, the US government, a number of other national governments, and the European Union. And the European Union, which at that time and is still presided by Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, a German politician, she somehow negotiated a $71 billion contract with Pfizer to give Pfizer almost a monopoly on vaccination throughout the European Union. And the European Union bought 4 billion doses of vaccines from Pfizer, so that basically it was expected that every person in the EU would get 8 to 10 vaccines shots. Otherwise, why would you need 4 billion vaccines for a bit more than 400 million people? So there was something very unusual about that. And all the contracts were apparently negotiated on cell phone between Mrs. van der Leyen and the president of Pfizer, and everything was kept confidential. All the messages were then deleted from the phone, and the contract was kept secret. Most of it was heavily redacted, and there is no real information about what is in the vaccines in the Pfizer vaccines, nor what are the commercial clauses that were essentially discussed. And they included, we know that at least, they included complete immunity for Pfizer and for the other vaccine manufacturer, which in that case is Moderna. Because let's remember that Moderna and Pfizer share the same vaccine formulation. Actually, it came from Moderna to Pfizer through an intercorporate agreement, so that Pfizer now has to pay royalties to Moderna. And Moderna itself seems to have gotten it from a lab associated with the CDC, which is the Center for Disease Control in the US. So it seems that this was all government research, which was essentially subcontracted or outsourced to private companies. And those private companies made, of course, huge contracts and huge profits on this vaccine, even though it has been acknowledged before the European Parliament in an inquiry by the Pfizer representatives that they had no real evidence about the efficiency of the vaccines, nor did they know if the vaccine would have any adverse effects, because they had not had time to do the testing. And therefore, it was essentially an unproven product. And furthermore, the president of the French High Council for Health, Mr. Dr. De Frécy, he said shortly before he left his position early this year, he said that basically the Pfizer vaccine, mRNA vaccine, was not really a vaccine. It was a new form of genetic or genic treatment. And now getting a medicine for an illness which you don't have is a very unusual thing. So that's pretty much in a nutshell where we are.
Repeat this phrase, Com. Genetic engineering. Is that what you said?
Yes, essentially it modifies the human genome.
Could you explain that a little bit?
Well, again, I'm not a physician. I'm not a scientist, so I am only relying on the testimonies of very eminent scientists, some of whom I know personally, and one of them was the head of research at Institut Pasteur for AIDS. So he speaks with a lot of authority, and whatever I am saying now is certainly approved by him. In fact, he wrote an article for our journal, World Affairs, in which he says pretty much the same thing. What happens is that the mRNA vaccine is a messenger of what is called RNA, or those who have any kind of scientific education will understand. RNA is part of the genetic code, basically. It is, if you like, the genetic code. And the messenger RNA vaccine is like a message which you send at the molecular level to give the genetic code an information, which the genetic code will then use, your immune system will use, to hunt a particular kind of virus and destroy it. The problem with that...
But the virus doesn't exist yet in your body, right?
Well, that's exactly the thing.
Was it meant to also reduce your reproductive power or impact your reproductive powers?
Well, this is still under some sort of discussion, but there are plenty of testimonies with a lot of statistics, which you can find in very official websites, showing that there has been a drastic increase in premature birth and
abortions,
and a reduction in, therefore, the fertility of men. Now, that's a separate thing, of course, the reduction in the fertility of men, apart from many other effects. But the primary effect, which is now acknowledged, I would say universally at the scientific level, is that the Pfizer RNA vaccine messenger vaccine does create blood clots. And the blood clots can become a grave cause of illness, particularly strokes, heart attacks, and a number of other afflictions. That is now recognized even by the US FDA as of the last few days, but it has been acknowledged. There have been multiple scientific reports based on peer-reviewed studies from Germany, from the UK, from Sweden, from the United States, from Canada, and on, from Japan. And all of them pretty much conclude that the RNA vaccines pose a serious risk to cardiovascular health in people of all ages. And that's why you have a large increase in the sudden death from heart attacks, including in young, healthy people, especially young males, and in children. Now, we don't understand why.
I mean, we've seen videos of people dancing and suddenly falling, dropping dead,
Yeah,
of people walking in a market and suddenly dropping dead, of people on a or persons on a treadmill suddenly dropping. I mean, all kinds of activities, or doing nothing but suddenly dropping dead. That's happened, and also paralytic strokes, because
yeah.
blood clots also cause that. I personally know quite a few such cases of paralytic strokes, or even loss of eyesight thanks to the vaccine. So tell me, continue, please.
Yes, a lot of adverse effects are being recorded and registered, and the sources are multiple. You also have people who are working in the sector of death management, in the sense people who are involved with mortuaries, heads of mortuaries, who have testified in the dozens that they see a sharp increase in sudden death of middle-aged and young people from heart problems, and also the development of a number of other immune deficiency disorders, melanomas, which suddenly go out of control. This has, by the way, has been predicted by a number of the scientists whom I mentioned in the beginning. So it's not as if it should be a surprise. Unfortunately, the reaction of most Western governments has been simply to try to censor the news and claim that there was nothing wrong and that people just died because they had to die. They had some other problem that wasn't known. But clearly, their whole policy has been to try to prevent the news from spreading, because let's face it, they are in a very awkward situation. Under the Nuremberg laws, it is illegal to force people to take an experimental drug, medication, or treatment without their consent.
Lung fibrosis and all kinds of other problems, which are far worse than anything that the virus, so called virus, real or imaginary, could have inflicted.
That is indeed the case. Yes, of course, the policy of many governments has been to say, and of the international medical and health agencies, has been to claim that a lot more people would have died from COVID if it hadn't been for the vaccines. But there is absolutely no proof of that. How can you prove that people would have fallen ill and died if they didn't? And on the other hand, when you show them the statistics showing that a lot of people are dying or falling very ill, they suddenly refuse. They claim that, well, there must be some other reason, or it's only a small percentage. Now, normally, if a few people fall ill after a new vaccine is introduced or a new medicine is introduced, that medicine is withdrawn from the market immediately. Why wasn't it done in this case? If you are told, well, it's maybe only 1 person in 100 who falls ill or dies, excuse me, do you realize what it means to take a 1 in 100 chance of dying? It's Russian roulette. I mean, maybe it's less than Russian roulette, but it's still a very major risk. And to force people to take this risk without proper information. And it's interesting if you look at the inside discussions that were held inside some of the governments, when they realized that they had to somehow force people to take the vaccine. I mean, in Europe, we were getting every 10 minutes a message on any medium, whether it was radio, television, the internet. You were constantly told, vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate. And once you have your dose after 3 months or after 4 months, you have to have another one, and you can go on for 5, 6, 7, we don't know how many doses. And whenever anybody basically said, well, excuse me, this goes against the laws of health, it goes against the Nuremberg Code, then they somehow had to find a way out. So they said, all right, you are not formally compelled to vaccinate, but you will not have access to any public place unless you vaccinate, which means you cannot go to work, you cannot go shopping, you cannot take the train, you cannot take the bus, you cannot fly, you cannot take the boat unless you vaccinate. So naturally, this was an indirect way of forcing people to do something against their will and without properly informing them.
Now, this person, Shilpa, had talked about brain fog, allergies. Again, I know several cases of people who are going through these symptoms. Um, but I'm sure you know better than a person like me, a lay person like me, that now they're talking about vaccinating. Even in India, WHO has started a campaign that 9 to 14-year-old girls are to be vaccinated for possible appearance of cervical cancer. I mean, have you heard anything so bizarre?
This goes with
9 get vaccinated for cervical cancer when there are no symptoms of any such thing. In future it may happen. And you remember that, what's the name of that actress who got all her organs removed because some physicians told her she may get cancer after 1 year?
Angelina Jolie took
Then she
off
will
both
have
her breasts because she was told that she had a genetic predisposition to breast cancer. So she was advised to remove both her breasts.
and some other organs also.
Could be. Could be.
Yes,
This
yes.
is the problem with genetic medicine. It becomes genetic fatalism or determinism. That if you have the wrong genes, then you are going to get this no matter what you do. So you might as well take action before you have any symptom or any illness,
You
which
may
in
as well
itself is a very dramatic.
because your ancestors died, your parents died, so you may as well prematurely kill yourself then. Why just
Absolutely,
stop at removing your breast? It's so
absolutely.
absurd. It's
Well,
so
this is a different topic, but I can briefly refer to the fact that in Canada, they are now trying to make it popular to consider premature death for people who are just too old or who don't feel, that they have much left to do in life. So they are even spreading in the schools among the children that, information about how to contemplate ending the lives of your elders, and helping them go through that. So clearly there is an incitation to getting rid of people who are old and who may constitute a burden for society. I mean, let's face it, this is where
say
we
it
are
again.
going.
Say it again. This part I didn't know, that children, school children, are being trained to get rid of or help the elderly um, commit suicide or die, just so
Well,
that.
yeah, that's exactly what it amounts to. Of course, they will claim that this is nothing of the sort. They are just trying to educate children into the realities of life. And there is that option of putting an end to your life instead of suffering. And of course, probably making others suffer because they have to take care of you. So why not instead, get people used to that? I mean, let's face it, this is part of the new mindset. It's also like educating children to the possibility of changing their sex, changing their gender, because operations are available if they decide that they want to be a girl or a boy, no matter how they were born. So, this is very much the so-called woke, the sort of new enlightenment that we talked about in another show. But clearly, the genetic determinism, which is all controlled now increasingly by computer programs, is a very dangerous thing because we are putting artificial intelligence, if we want to call it that way, in charge of many vital decisions through computer models, which are then supposed to be implemented. And I don't know if you are aware that in California, and it's not the only state, where they are basically trying to deprive doctors of any ability to make decisions about their patients. Doctors will become essentially subservient to pharmaceutical companies. They will apply the treatments that are prescribed by state authorities, which are obviously controlled, financed by vaccine and medical manufacturers, medicine manufacturers, who are essentially taking control of health, and this is something that we are staring at in the face. That instead of a doctor individually, according to his experience, treating a patient for a particular condition, what you will have will be a sort of a boilerplate computerized system in which people will be given drugs and treatments and operations. And this will all come from a sort of medicine central, and I mean it looks unbelievable, but you have to see how doctors in most of Europe were told not to treat the patients of COVID with the traditional medicine they would use for example, flu, because no, it's not possible. You cannot use ivermectin, you cannot use uh, hydroxychloroquine, or you will be removed from the profession. Your license will be withdrawn because you are applying uh, illegal medicines, even though they are not harmful. They don't have serious side effects of any kind. But still, it was not allowed. Why? Because you had to leave all the room for the vaccines, which were still to be perfected, but which were already becoming mandatory. So that is a very unique situation, which most of the trained professionals immediately reacted to. I mean, if you look at the Great Barrington Declaration, which was signed by hundreds of physicians, and then you have many other organizations, the World Alliance of Physicians, you have, I mean, a number of very eminent professional organizations which said this is crazy. What are we doing? We are just breaking away from traditional medicine, even traditional Western medicine, to go into some sort of technological delirium that everybody has to go through those vaccines because that's the only way to live nowadays. And then from that perspective, you could have new vaccines being brought every year into the market for all sorts of diseases that you don't have, but which you will have to vaccinate against in order to remain a member of society.
Uh, are people able to access courts, file? Because in the West, we know amazing stories about how if a hot coffee spilled on someone's lap, they would, file $1 million suit against the coffee vendor because they got hurt from the spillover or something like, even for fairly frivolous things, people go to court and claim millions of dollars. Are they able to do it for this? How are the courts responding, Com?
It is beginning to happen. You see, everything is about the critical mass. That's what Rainer Fulmek also explained on many occasions. That if a few people are complaining, people can just bury the complaints and say, you are just essentially fantasizing, or you are a conspiracy theorist. But if lots of people come up with recorded and tested and recognized illnesses, and or who have lost relatives shortly after vaccination, it's very difficult to shut everybody up, even though the pharmaceutical companies have no legal responsibility. The governments also claim they have no responsibility, but of course, eventually, they have to be responsible. They cannot just duck it forever. And if you have heard Dr. Asim Malhotra, who is one of the most vocal, uh, sportspersons now in Britain, because his father died shortly after getting the vaccine, and Dr. Asim Malhotra, who was originally quite a strong proponent of these vaccines, now has become you might say, a champion of the fight against the vaccines, and even got a member of the British Parliament to speak about it and request the government to immediately stop the vaccination campaign. Now, in the European Parliament, there have been hearings, and Mrs. van der Leyen is under investigation for corruption. I mean, we know that nowadays a number of MEPs in the European Parliament have been indicted for corruption, and even some of them, at least one of them, is in jail, who was vice president of the European Parliament. But Mrs. van der Leyen is also under investigation. Obviously, some of these corruption cases related to Qatar and the World Cup. But you can imagine that other forms of corruption are being practiced. And we know very well that major pharmaceutical companies are financing lots of physicians and scientists just to have them support their drugs. Essentially, it's I mean, you pay somebody a number of, a large amount of money, you invite him to some conferences, and you make sure that he spreads the good word about your drugs. That is the way a lot of the pharmaceutical companies operate nowadays.
Yeah, we know that it's a mafia. It's pharmaceutical companies are not about health. They are about promoting all kinds of dangerous drugs simply because, in fact, it suits them very well that you take X medicine for X disease, and it creates three more breakdowns in your system. So you went for kidney treatment, but you ended up with a liver failure or a heart failure or a heart episode. So then you're a permanent patient all
Yeah,
your
exactly.
life.
You are on medicine all your life, you know. Basically, they want to treat you, not cure you. This may sound very cynical, but
But it is
the laws
that's
of
what
the
practically
financial world are like that. You know, you want to have clients forever. You don't want to lose them.
But tell me, how is it that politicians haven't died? No head of
Well,
state is.
actually, some politicians have died, including one vice president of the European Parliament who suddenly collapsed very shortly after getting his second dose, I believe, of the vaccine. But then again, you know, let's face it, I don't want to get into things which I do not know or cannot prove. But there have been a lot of allegations about certain politicians essentially not taking the vaccine and being given some sort of a placebo just to show that they were, you know, part of the team. And that we cannot know for sure, but there are at least some serious allegations that have been made by other politicians against them. And or some of them said, well, they already got COVID, so they didn't need to vaccinate, even though technically 6 months later you still had to vaccinate. But now there is a general acknowledgement that even if you are not gravely sick, thank God, or you don't, you are not dead, certainly your immune system has been weakened. And because now essentially you have got this heavy dose of mRNA, you know, which essentially will destroy your own capacity to produce these antibodies, and therefore you will have to take the same mRNA every few months because otherwise, within 3 months, the protective effect disappears. So even if you believe in the protection that the mRNA vaccine gives you, the fact is that you will have to take it every few months. And so, how long will you do that? Will you do that all their lives? There are now lots of people who took the vaccine 5 times, and some people react better than others. Again, we don't really know what's in these vaccines. You know, there have been many medical and scientific analysis done of what products they could get, and they did find some very unusual metals, including graphene oxide, which we don't know what role it plays in this. They say that the most dangerous part of the vaccine is the so-called spike protein. You know, but then again, there are certain things that we do not know about, and pharmaceutical companies, under the protection of patent laws, are refusing to reveal their ingredients. It's like Coca-Cola; you don't really know what's all that is in Coca-Cola. You know, so
Well, Baba Ramdev has given it the best possible name, which is it's the most effective toilet cleaner. You pour Coca Cola down a flush of a toilet pot, and it gets better cleaning. It does better cleaning than anything else because it's so corrosive. Now, coming back to this vaccine, the point is China started it all, right? That's where the scare started.
yeah.
Now, then we were told China is now all well, all fine, and things are normal, hunky dory, and suddenly we are told that things have gone out of control and millions are again afflicted. Is it part of a well rehearsed or well orchestrated drama, or is it for real? Or is it that their vaccine is so poisonous that people are actually dying thanks to the vaccine? What is the real story?
Well, as you know, China had its own vaccine, which most people in the rest of the world did not accept, except in a few countries that are close to China. But otherwise, the Chinese vaccine apparently is not very effective in any case, but it is not, to my knowledge, an mRNA vaccine. So the question is, traditional vaccines are known not to be efficacious against pulmonary infections, viral infections. And that's precisely why they went for mRNA vaccine, supposedly the real panacea. You know. But this being said, I think China's case is very peculiar because, as you know, the Americans had done the research on COVID-19. We know which labs did it. We know how it was done. It was connected to military research. because Americans always work very actively on biowarfare, either to prevent infection of their people or to perhaps infect other people if they feel it's a strategic necessity. So, in any event, there are many labs working under US funding in many parts of the world. There were 38 in Ukraine alone, if you remember the news, the official news. But in the US, President Obama decided early in his presidency that there should be no research on mRNA vaccines, especially no research on enhancement of the toxicity, what they call gain of function. So then he said that cannot be done here. So then the American labs concerned, including Dr. Fauci's organization, decided to outsource the research to the Wuhan lab in China. And it was therefore a joint program between the Americans and the Chinese with American funding, part American funding. So then we don't know what happened, why the virus escaped, or was it deliberately spread out? I mean, it seems unlikely that the Chinese would have infected their own population. So something else may have happened. There might have been an accident. Whatever the case may be, the fact is that the Chinese very early on got very scared after trying to hide what was happening. They suddenly decided to clamp down and close the entire province in which Wuhan is located. And that, of course, spread worldwide. And then, of course, they have kept people literally for the last couple of years under some succession of lockdowns, which were, of course, extremely traumatic, extremely painful for the economy and for people's well-being. And clearly, before the last plenum of the Chinese Communist Party, they didn't want to release, to lift the restrictions. There were some political reasons for that. They wanted to keep everybody quiet. But they also realized that they were not only damaging their economy in a very major way, but that they were also creating massive unrest in China. There were huge protests. People were beginning to attack the police and fight them, which is very rare in China. And they were really, revolting. They were not accepting anymore that tyranny, which forced them to stay home when hardly anybody was seriously ill. So at that point, after the plenum was held and Xi Jinping was securely re-elected, they have decided that they have to restart their economy. And therefore, they have said now, not only do you no longer have to go in quarantine, you no longer have to be in lockdown, but you also have to work even if you have COVID, if you are COVID positive. Because a lot of people are COVID positive without being sick. It is well known that if you have got this virus and it's not really having an effect on your immune system, then you are fine. I mean, nothing happens. So then they said, all right, now you can go to work. And of course, the rest of the world is now coming down on China saying, how can you be also irresponsible? Now you are going to spread it amongst all of us. But then again, I think the Chinese have realized, if they didn't know it before, that nowadays this infection is a seasonal one and it is relatively mild. It is just another kind of flu. And many people will get it. Some people who are in poor health might get very sick or die. But generally speaking, if you take the right medication, you are going to be fine. And it will just take a few days that are obviously not pleasant. Nobody likes to have a flu, but that's nature of life, So I think the Chinese have said enough is enough because they were also heavily indoctrinated by the WHO. And now they have said we really need to make a living. We cannot just keep our economy tied down by this whole thing, which might never end. And actually, it's true. In a TV show the other day, I said that trying to eradicate COVID is a fool's errand. It's never going to happen. The question is that if COVID becomes insignificant, nobody will talk about it. If it hadn't been for this obsessive coverage, it would have been a lot easier to go through it. It's just that people were getting panicky because they were terrified day and night about what they couldn't do. People didn't even dare step out. And if they came into their homes, they had to wash their clothes. They had to disinfect themselves. It had become madness for some people.
Yeah. Now, they did the same with the AIDS virus at one time, where Bill Gates again had heavy involvement in the AIDS virus.
And Fauci too.
And
Fauci was very instrumental in using. I don't want to get into that, but he had a very controversial role, which probably made the epidemic worse.
now, we've all forgotten about AIDS. Nobody talks about it as if it's vanished. or it doesn't matter if you die due to AIDS, if you die from other illnesses, it doesn't really matter. And here, the absurdity of it is, number one, they insist there has to be universal vaccination. Now, somebody here said this is not the first time in human history. The Brits had done it. One of our viewers was saying it. But it's never been global. If
Yeah.
ever it was done, X or Y vaccine or some other enforced treatment, it was in relatively smaller pockets. But in this case, it's the entire globe that was made to feel like death was imminent unless they took the shots. And whether you wanted it or not, they forced them down. In India, we saw people being dragged out of their homes in villages and being pumped with those shots because people were reluctant to do it. Now, what do you have any idea of the number of deaths that are confirmed or are believed to be due to vaccine? What are the numbers looking like?
We don't know, honestly, because a lot of different statistics have been offered. But, everything is so uncertain. For example, recently there was a very high level scientific survey done in France on 26,000 former COVID patients. And they found that out of these 26,000, according to the analysis of their, it was essentially a biological analysis, it was a physiological analysis, they found that about only 1,000 gave evidence for having been infected with the COVID virus. The other 25,000 had never had it. They must have had another kind of flu or cold. And because everybody was so psyched up that everybody was getting COVID, then they all assumed they were getting COVID. And the hospitals treated them like COVID patients, whether or not they were admitted to hospital. So how do you know? The numbers of the COVID patients may be a lot lower than what we heard. At one point, we were accumulating deaths all over the world, saying now what, 2 million, 3 million, although frankly, there was, in most cases, there was no, because now it's been recognized that a lot of patients were actually dying from other causes in hospital. And they were, since they had COVID, they were recorded as COVID death.
Yes, they
Even the
did that.
Chinese have now admitted it. The government has said, listen, we are no longer going to consider people dying from COVID unless they die of breathing insufficiency, in other words, of asphyxiation. Otherwise, if they die of something else, then we are not going to say that they died from COVID, even if they happen to have the COVID virus. So clearly, this whole thing has been completely manipulated, and we have no way of knowing what really happened. Now, if you look at today at what's happening in terms of the deaths which are suspected of being from vaccination with mRNA vaccines, then you are looking at increase in the rate of death, which is very significant and not explainable otherwise. So obviously, they are talking about a 4,000% increase, for example, in abortions, premature
4,000%?
yeah. And in the
Four.
US Army, they have some very alarming statistics as well, with a vast number of military officers and soldiers who are getting heart disease and all sorts of other problems. And of course, a larger number than usual died suddenly. So as a result, now there is a moratorium. The US government has had to sign a moratorium on all vaccine obligations. In other words, they no longer can require people to be vaccinated. And one of the major forces behind this pressure, which was imposed on the Biden administration, because Biden was desperate to get everybody vaccinated, he even told people who had been under a hurricane that, if you get a hurricane, then the best for you is to be vaccinated, because without vaccination, the hurricane will be a lot more deadly, whatever that meant. So, it came into complete idiocy. But the fact is that the army in the US and a number of Republican senators have been pushing for a complete stop to vaccination. And I think the same will happen in Britain. I think in the continent, we are still behind, although the Germans have had to give up on it because the German parliament rejected the government insistence on compulsory vaccination. And then in France, the government is still saying we strongly recommend vaccinating the infants, the children from the age of 6 months. With Pfizer vaccines, So it
You
shows
have to
how
be mad to want to do that. I mean,
it's completely
does your
absurd. No child of that age
French
has died of COVID,
president?
and there is no evidence at all for any harmful effect or any significant harmful effect on children. So I think it's a commercial imperative. You know, they bought so many vaccines that now they have to try to use them because
Yeah,
these
but if
vaccines are
they
going to
end
get
up with
out.
calm, but if they end up with such a large percentage of very sickly population, how are they going to run the country, the economy, the society? It's going to be a breakdown, complete breakdown of societies if people are forever, perpetually falling ill, especially in the armed forces. I mean, I worry most about our armed forces who are already battling very hostile physical environment. You know, somewhere they are in freezing snow, in parts of India where they are in the mountainous regions. They are half the year they are freezing. They're operating in freezing cold. Other places like the desert of Rajasthan, Gujarat, it's boiling hot. And in such a situation, if soldiers are falling dead or are of compromised health, what are we going to do?
You
Did
know, for
Pakistan
India,
take?
as you said, we don't know exactly what went on. India mostly vaccinated people with the indigenous made Indian vaccine. And the other vaccine used was AstraZeneca, really. And AstraZeneca was quickly stopped in the West because it was alleged that it created blood clots. Now, the interesting question is why did they stop the AstraZeneca vaccine and took another vaccine, Pfizer, which created even more blood clots, according to records? So there is no real logic in that. But recently, the head of AstraZeneca in Britain was knighted by King Charles, and we don't quite know why, because his vaccine was essentially considered inefficient or even harmful for a certain, at least for a certain section of the population. It was withdrawn. So why then give him a knighthood? That's one of the mysteries of the current pharmaceutical raj, you know, where these companies get congratulated for basically producing medicines which have very dubious effects. Another thing which should be said
No, but
is
I
that
would like to inform William Dunster, who asked me this question. No, William, India is not monitoring side effects of Covishield. Not at all. In fact, people are petrified of talking about it. So far from documenting it, setting up a system for taking count of people who are falling ill, people aren't even willing to report it. Or doctors who know it is because of the vaccine are not even willing to report it because they can be punished severely for questioning the efficacy of the vaccine. It's still not a domain where people are able to talk about it freely, question freely, because it gets also mixed up with, oh, you're anti government, you know, you're anti Modi government, and all that. So it gets so messy because people want, those who are pro government want you to accept everything the government does blindly, and those who are anti-government are in any case so lunatics, they are so idiotic that they criticize even the good things the government does. So nobody takes each other seriously. We have this curious case, and I think it's true as much for America and perhaps even in England, that the ruling party and the opposition are at war with each other. So either you support the ruling party whole hog or you oppose it whole hog. So no issue gets discussed on merit, no issue gets discussed with facts on the table. It's all about whose side you're on. Are you on my side or on the enemy side? That's how the discussion goes, which is why very few people have the guts and the consequences are very severe. So, anyway, what I want to know from you, Com, is this. At one time, China was seen as the culprit, prime culprit, for inventing the virus, man made virus, and then, of course, spreading it. Now, is it actually the culprit or a victim? Or have they decided that this is the best way to control their population? So why not let people die in millions? What's the story in China?
Before I go there, let me tell you there are two very important things to be kept in mind. One, India was absolutely right in being one of the few governments that said, excuse me, when Pfizer came and said, why don't you get our vaccines? They are the best. They said, are you taking responsibility? And Pfizer said, no, we are not taking responsibility for anything. This is people's responsibility. So then the government said, sorry, we cannot accept a vaccine for which the manufacturer is not taking responsibility. So that was a very good thing to do, which many other governments didn't do because they thought they had no choice. In Argentina, for example, they were literally racketeered by Pfizer, which said, well, we want guarantees for payment. And therefore, we will have a lien on your properties, on state property, if you don't pay the bills, no, which of course created a huge problem because Argentina was looking like it was selling its national capital in order to get vaccines. But anyway, this is another matter. The fact is that on the one hand, India was right, and probably I would assume that the vaccines that were used in India are not nearly as harmful, at least from what I've seen. None of the many friends I have in India seem to have been affected. So that's a good thing. On the other hand, the other very important caveat is that
No, can't say.
mRNA vaccines are not vaccines. So let's not go against all vaccines. You see, that's the issue. That
No,
the
the
moment you say,
issue
oh,
is
you're anti-vax, so you don't like
the
bleeding
issue.
vaccines.
No,
Hmm?
Com. The issue is something else and far more basic. Let's not give a good character certificate to any particular vaccine, nor a bad character certificate without knowing enough. The point that I'm trying to make is this. Number one, India followed the same madness, which is whether or not you are ill, whether or not you have symptoms, whether or not you need it, you have to have it. Never before in history has any government said you have to take a disease, a medicine, or a vaccination for something that you may at some point in future may or may not get. It never happened. And you couldn't say no. I mean, of course, I said no. And I openly declared it. I didn't do it surreptitiously. I openly declared that even if the government were to put a gun to my head, I would rather die of gunshot than of this vaccine. And it's also a case of my right to my body. I don't understand all those crazy lunatic feminists in America and Europe who will shout this, my right, my body. Never said a word, never whispered this slogan, even
Yeah,
once
well, that's a
saying,
very
I take
interesting comment on the
responsibility for
left.
my health. And no, but more importantly, Com, you need to know this. Recently, in the Supreme Court, when a particular petitioner had gone complaining about the aftermath of the vaccine, the government said, no, it was not compulsory. We are not responsible. They said it in Supreme Court. People took it voluntarily. It's their problem, not our problem. So they are completely disowning responsibility, even though they inflicted it, even on school children, even on young. And I mean, look at the absurdity of it. Firstly, they said you have to take it because you may fall ill. So if you ask them and said, if I take it, does it guarantee that I will not get COVID? They said, no, there's no guarantee. You may still get it, but it won't be as bad
Yeah.
as when you take it. Then, okay, all right. If it's not as bad as when I take it, does it mean I won't die of it? They said, no, 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 you may die, but the death won't be as painful as it may be when you don't take it. Now,
Yeah.
one, one that,
You'll go to paradise if you
yeah,
take it.
yeah. I mean, look at that. You
Yeah.
may never die. But
Yeah.
then, what if I die because of the vaccine? Or if I get a paralytic stroke because of the vaccine? They said, no, 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 that can't be. I mean, that's something you may get even otherwise. But it may not be as bad as if you don't take. I mean, what kind of logic is it?
No, you see,
So
in the
you're
West, we
forcing
use
me, is the
the
government taking
other.
this? No, if you ask them, you forced me. You forced my child. You wouldn't let the child get into school. You wouldn't let me get into a train. You wouldn't let me fly. You wouldn't let me enter a shopping mall. You wouldn't let me get out of the house. And they say, but we didn't force you. But what else is coercion? If to deny you jobs, you wouldn't let me enter my working space, you won't let me enter any public space, you won't let me do X number of things. And then they say, but we didn't force you, you took it. This kind of duplicity and absence of responsibility, and they are ready now. WHO is peddling the vaccine for little girls as young as 9 year olds,
Six
9 to
months in
14,
France, you know. I
compulsory
mean,
vaccination
yeah,
to prevent ovarian cancer. Who's ever heard of ovarian cancer at the age of 9, 10, 11? I mean,
yeah,
it's madness. They
yeah,
don't even check if you have ovaries. For all
yeah.
you know, I may not have ovaries, but they still want to vaccinate me. It's madness. So I don't think we can speak favorably of the Indian vaccine simply because they're not taking responsibility. Secondly, uh, lot of people have had serious health issues. A lot of people have died despite the vaccine, and now they are saying another round of booster dose. Uh, that's madness of the worst kind.
Well,
So,
Bill Gates has just announced that a new pandemic is coming around. He
yeah.
knows, even though nobody knows
So
how he
I
knows,
think
but he
the
knows.
slogan has to be my body, my responsibility.
Yeah.
Not my right, but my responsibility. I think the Sarkari Karan, which is governmentalization of my healthcare, is the most disastrous thing that has ever happened as far as India is concerned. Because in India, we took care of our health issues largely with home based remedies, which are intimately connected to Ayurveda.
Mhm.
And I'm sure you remember when Patanjali and other Vaidyas claimed that they had a solution, a very simple one, which will boost your immune system. So, no matter which virus came, no matter which infection came, if your immune system is strengthened instead of compromised, you can fight it out. And that's happened. I got the virus 3 times over in the last 3 years or whatever. I didn't take even a painkiller. I didn't take a crocine or dolo, none of that. I just counted on my Ayurvedic brews. And, you know, Patanjali's or Sri Ravi Shankar has also very effective immune system boosting remedies. Ayush Ministry has, but they've not let Ayush Ministry, which knows the Ayurvedic remedies, actually promote it on the scale it needs to. Now, I really think if Modi government actually wants to lead the war against vaccine, against COVID, they better start supplying Patanjali's coronil or Sri Ravi Shankar's remedies. They're working fine. They're
Yeah.
working very well.
Yeah.
And honestly, the world will recognize that they've been conned when they find these very simple remedies. And half of them, these herbs
Yeah.
that are curing, can be grown in your backyard or in little flower pots. We grow so many herbs that we usually daily pluck and make brews from. So
Yes.
it's really so irresponsible that when we had it within our reach, and thank God in India, thanks to the spread of Ayurveda, because of Patanjali's massive campaign, though they paid a very heavy price for it, 1,500 criminal cases launched against Patanjali for merely claiming
Yes.
that they had done trials on significant number of people who all got help and cured with their Ayurvedic remedies and some amount of pranayam and improved food habits. Instead of lockdown, I really believe if they lock down all sugar factories, white sugar factories, the immune system of the global population will improve dramatically. If they lock down or all maida or white flour, that
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
processed flour
Mm.
with which you make your breads, we in India never used to have that. And instead we switched to coarser grains, our immune system would improve dramatically. That's all they needed to lock down. Lock down Pepsi Cola, Coca Cola, lock down all the chocolate factories which are loaded with sugar, junk food, lock down all the junk food outlets, all the cookies and all those yummy ice creams loaded with ice cream and, I mean, with sugar
Yeah.
and chemicals.
Mm.
Lock those down, and your health will improve. And you will be able to fight back not just this particular virus, whatever its strain. And just because they find a new name, a new sexy name every few months, are we going to become guinea pigs time and again with their booster doses? This is so ridiculous. So
Yes,
my
I did follow the Ayurvedic precepts during the entire COVID crisis, and I
uh,
was never ill. In fact, I was better than usual. And there are certain traditional Ayurvedic medicines which I got supplied from my Ayurvedic Vaidya family in Hyderabad, which makes their own medicines, the Raju family. But there are many such families that do wonderful products, and if you do follow these rules, you are much less likely to get sick. And in fact, as you know, Uttar Pradesh under Yogi under Yogi did spread massive amounts of ivermectin among people, which helped a lot of them. That's why India had a relatively low per capita death rate during the epidemic. Again, because of things like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, which were banned in the West. You could get in trouble even as a physician if you advertised it or if you gave it. They could actually stop you from practicing, saying you are giving a forbidden substance, which is unbelievable. When you think that many dangerous medicines have been spread among the population, think of the opioid crisis in America. The pharmaceutical companies that manufactured opioids killed hundreds of thousands of Americans knowing that they were killing them. And now we know from the inner reports of Pfizer that have surfaced that they were actually aware of the risk of heart failure and arterial, say congestion, in the sense they were aware that there were cardiovascular problems connected to their vaccine, which is not even a vaccine, as I repeat, which is actually a genic treatment. Even then, they went ahead. Why? Because there was too much money to be made, and the governments were pushing them. We need them today, tomorrow. This is all an arrangement between the McKinseys of the world, the governments, and the pharmaceutical companies. So the whole policy of putting people in this constant state of so-called prevention through drugs and through, essentially new products which are meant to create immunity, all you are doing is multiplying problems and creating new ones because you are not really aware of what you are doing over the long term. You just go on some sort of experimental path, and you feel that if you vaccinate people against so many different things, you will protect them. And now in France and in many other European countries, infants, from the day they are born, they have to undergo 16 different vaccinations. Can you believe it? 16 vaccines against 16 different things. And this was before COVID came along.
oh my, 16 vaccines.
Yes, against everything you
And,
can imagine.
even for something as simple as flu, I believe they are vaccinating people
Yeah,
right
yeah,
at
they are
birth.
hoping that they will somehow eradicate every disease and probably achieve eternal life. This is the absurdity of our society where we are pursuing immortality through drugs, and of course that's never going to happen.
Eternal youth and eternal life,
Mhm,
fear of death. And that
mhm.
way, I think we Hindus are lucky because we know there are many cycles of birth and death. And so this body is just going to go through another transition, um, and be reborn or reappear in some form or the other. So we're not so desperate about being um, immortal, or do everything in this life, and, do it all. The point is, w- what do we do to fight this bio war? One. Secondly, don't you agree that WHO is one of the most compromised, the most scam ridden of all UN organizations? Most UN agencies are scam ridden. Um, but I would put WHO on top of the heap. Would you agree? And if I had my way, I would throw them out of India. What do you
Well,
say?
Trump, one of his good ideas was to make the US go out of the WHO. Uh, Obviously, he was attacked for that because people said, you are irresponsible, we need a global health and medical institution. But actually, I agree with you. WHO is too controlled and influenced by both politics and high finance, and therefore they cannot be trusted. And then again, to impose universal protocols for all countries, given the very different circumstances that prevail, is doomed to fail. It is not going to be possible to achieve an effective health policy at the global level for everyone. That's one thing. The other thing is that what do we do about it? Well, I think it can only come from a change in consciousness, which has to spread among people to the point where they make these policies change because they are no longer willing to follow them. If only 5 or 10% people refuse, they are in trouble because they can be either isolated from society or they can be compelled to submit. But if enough people say, no more of this nonsense, we refuse it, which, by the way, is happening a lot in the West. I can tell you that most people don't want to hear of another vaccination now. It may be a bit late for many, but now they are just fed up with being told that, careful, you will get a flu, you have to go and vaccinate, and then after 3 months, you'll vaccinate again. I mean, what sort of a vaccine is this? It's like a sort of a pass for the public transport. You have to, every now and then, you have to put some money into your pass to be able to travel. I mean, this is absurd. I mean, it's putting life on a sort of a short-term, lease basis.
Yeah.
And that's completely absurd. I mean, at some point, it's unacceptable and it's not even viable. So let's hope that this changes the way people perceive their relationship with the institutions. In the West, too, we have this continuous a promise that there was another life after death, and therefore we should not be afraid of death. And if we were good, we would go to a good place, and God would smile on us. And that kept a lot of people going through life with faith and hope. Now we have pretty much eliminated this, and we have replaced religion by a sort of scientific dogmatism, which is that pharmaceuticals will save you, and maybe in the future you won't even need to die, or you'll live for 150 years or whatever. And that's what has made people so blindly reliant on medicine. I mean, I'm not saying they shouldn't take the right medicines when they need
No,
to,
no, 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 no,
obviously.
no. Just say use common sense first.
Exactly, absolutely.
Use
Common
the
sense,
body's healing powers before you resort to any medication.
yes.
I that is the first wisdom people need to get back to, which is your body has enormous healing power if you
Yes,
simply allow it to.
yes.
Lot of, 60% of illnesses can be cured by simply water, drinking a lot of clean water,
Mhm.
controlling your diet, and taking things,
Exercising,
exercising, and avoiding foods that compromise your
yes,
immune system. That top of the list is white sugar,
yes,
then processed foods, junk food, fried foods, especially if they're not in your own kitchen. Anything you fry at home in clean oil,
yeah,
as your grandmothers and mothers used
yeah.
to do, is
Mhm.
okay.
Mhm.
But purchasing fried food, French fries or fried chicken or any of that junk food,
Or
that
red
is
meat also. Red meat is not
already.
recommended
Yes.
for long-term health.
So actually, if you get clean water, you get clean air to breathe, and you take enough rest, which I don't. That's my Achilles heel. Not enough sleep. If you get enough sleep, and you don't overstress needlessly, which I do. So, two things that I need to work at, but other things I have already tested and tried, and I can tell you they work. They
Yes.
really
Mhm.
work. And that's all that's needed to be done. And the very frequency of illnesses, I mean, in the kind of poisonous air that we breathe in Delhi, it's very difficult to stay healthy. But on top of it, if you take these harmful medicines and you take antibiotics, firstly, antibiotics have messed up our immune system. To many people, have been very indiscriminately fed with antibiotics,
Yeah.
some even for small pimples. I know a lot of my young friends who take pimples, I mean, who take antibiotics just because they got two pimples on their face. It's so absurd. And these
Yeah.
are teenage manifestations.
No, and as a
But
result, antibiotics become ineffective, and then you have to create new ones in order
yeah,
to achieve any kind of efficiency, So this
yeah,
is an endless process.
yeah, exactly. So thank you, Com, for a very comprehensive um, overview. But tell me, what do we do apart from massive resistance movement? Now, I'm getting very hopeful now that you tell me that in the West, there is massive resistance. And since the elite in India take all their wisdom from the West, hopefully they'll wake up. The poor, in any case, use common sense more often than the elite, the well educated, the Western educated, woke elites. Uh, they won't wake up anytime soon. But the rest of us who don't wish to be counted among the fashionable, um, better spread the word. And please, please, I urge you all to spread this information among your relatives, among your friends, that they have to resist the booster doses. If they've taken the two doses already and it hasn't saved anybody, it hasn't prevented COVID from appearing or if afflicting them, then there is absolutely no reason to believe that the booster dose will do it any better. So large scale, what was it called, civil disobedience, time for a massive global disobedience movement,
Yes,
civil
and
dis-
the hope that we can derive from what's happening is that not only China is obviously walking away now from this whole thing, which in itself has an impact, but the US is increasingly now divided between the so-called left, which is always in favor of compelling people, including compelling them to vaccinate. It's interesting that the left all over the world was pretty much in favor of compulsory vaccinations. This is the the left wing DNA, which is always forcing people to do things. On the other hand, the so-called right or even far right was always, if not highly skeptical, then sometimes very quietly opposed to it. And a lot of those parties which have come to power, as in Italy, as in Sweden, in other countries, they are now saying this is all nonsense. You have no right to inflict these treatments on people. Just stop it. And this is happening in America. I don't know if you realize that the man who is going to be the next, probably the next president of the US, the governor of Florida, Mr. DeSantis, he has now started an investigation into misdemeanors, crimes, and fraud committed by both government agencies and big pharmaceutical companies, leading to the death and illness of many people. And
wow.
this is now a state investigation, and it will obviously spread to other states, especially the so called red states. And a lot of people, including Fauci, will get into big trouble because let's face it, if you go to the end of it, and if it turns out that they did knowingly or out of negligence let lots of people become very ill or die, this is a crime against humanity by any standard. And
Yeah.
therefore, they are under Nuremberg law, which means that the punishments will be very severe. Fauci is almost 83 years old, so he probably feels he doesn't have much to lose. But
Yeah,
a lot
maybe
of people will
better
be in
die in
trouble.
prison, in a rotten prison, rather than die as a free man.
That's
I
very possible. Yes, yes. And we all know that this will happen to a lot of people who are in charge of the medical and health systems in the US and in Western countries, particularly those which have been the most compulsive about vaccination. For example, in Italy, the government, which is now considered to be far right, has cancelled vaccination obligation and has also reinstated all the personnel which was fired for refusing to vaccinate. So they have shown that basically they rejected the policies of the previous government, which was very much a globalist government run by a central banker. And therefore, you can see these national or regional initiatives which are now taking place. And I think India is in a good position because of its Ayurvedic and traditional medical heritage to spearhead a movement for return to natural health and medicine, and keeping all those new technologies under some sort of check. You cannot ask people to become genetically modified organisms for the sake of their future health.
True. Now, somebody asks me, how about samosas and golgappas? Let me give you my honest answer. Samosas are prime junk food. Maida, fried in oil that is used over and over again. The basic principle about frying in oil and keeping the fried food healthy is that you don't use the same oil over and over again. You use it once only. But when you have samosas made commercially, then they're obviously going to use the same oil till it becomes like diesel. They never throw it away. So samosas, to my mind, are junk food unless you make them at home with whole wheat flour or any other coarse grain flour. It's easy to make I mean, it may not be as crisp, but it'll be healthy. Golgappas. I used to love golgappas, but I would have them only when one of my masis made them at home. Now, there are few places that make healthier, because otherwise, if you have street golgappas with water that is unreliable, all kinds of filth around it, then it's not healthy. But golgappas are easy to make at home, not difficult one bit. And so get used to cooking at home. At least I prefer home food to any other food, because then you're sure of ingredients and you know what you're eating and how much harm or good it is capable of doing. So that's my story on Golgappa. Sorry to disappoint those who are samosa fans, but please make them at home. That's half the battle won. Even junk food can't be so junky if you make it at home, because at least your ingredients are safe. So don't ever deep fry and keep using that oil over and over again. And don't ever buy fried food where you know that since morning or since 3 days he's been cooking in the same oil and they never discard it. That really is my advice. And the other advice is, please take it seriously. Demand mohalla clinics of Ayurveda. You know, Patanjali has saved millions of lives by setting up its clinics everywhere, but their Vaidyas are not always so well trained. They're also prescribing, dispensing like a chemist shop. That's not what Ayurveda is supposed to do. But if we start demanding that we don't want many more allopathic hospitals, um, we want Ayurveda centers, especially mohalla clinics. Please make your local MLA MP respond to this need. Make this your primary demand. Have mohalla clinic of Ayurveda specialists, and we should cut down on the amount of chemist shops we have per each colony. Where I live, there are more chemist shops than there are any other kinds of shops for any other daily necessity. If you travel down India from north to south, what are the two most prevalent shops you'll find? Chemist and liquor shops, Sarkari liquor shops, both selling poisons. It's really important that we insist that Ayurveda clinics be set up in every mohalla, in every neighborhood, so we don't have to go far. Like, I live not far away from this premier Ayurveda institute, All India Institute of Ayurveda, but the load is so heavy. People start queuing up because it's free also. They start queuing up at 5 a.m. in the morning to get that coupon so that they can get entry. It's important that people don't have to go for ordinary ailments to a hospital, be it Ayurveda or any other. And allopathy is good only for emergencies. You've had a road accident, you need a surgery, or you know uh, in an emergency of some kind, that's good. I'm not totally discounting modern medicine, Western medicine, but it has to be used only 5% of times in your life, if at all. Best is to rely on common sense, your grandmother's wisdom, your traditional food habits, whichever part of the country you are from. Think of what your grandmother used to cook, how she used to cook, the grains she used, the oils she used. And of course, don't take refined oils. Sarson ka tel, til ka tel, nariyal ka tel, all our traditional oils are really healthy foods. Or desi gai ka ghee. All of these are health foods, superfoods. So avoid fortune, processed oil, what do you, the refined oil, super refined oil. If you do all those essential precautions, especially avoid white sugar, well, you're already on your way to better health. And Com, I would like you to introduce me to your Vedya, who's kept you healthy throughout this period, and tell me the medicines he gave you, or the prescriptions he gave you, which have kept you healthier, you said, through the COVID.
Yes, actually, yes. I will send you his particulars by email. You can contact him, give my
Yes.
name, and they will get back to you, and you can
No,
have
I'll
his.
also interview him.
Yes, he's in. They are in Hyderabad. It's a whole family, and they are in Ayurveda for the last 4 or 5 generations. So they have a very great experience, and they do have their patients from all over the world and all that. But they keep it on a small scale because Ayurveda is an individual thing. The moment you create these huge labs and pharmaceutical production outfits,
Yes.
you are obviously losing some of the
Yes.
virtues of it.
Yes, absolutely. I fully agree with you. And also, your Ayurvedic medicines firstly take into account your particular body type.
Yeah,
Uh, if you
medicines are
don't,
individually tailored. Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
individually
yeah,
tailored.
yeah.
That's right. And it's very important. But we are not really producing those kind of Vedyas anymore, not through the Sarkari, not through the governmental Ayurvedic hospitals, because they are modeling themselves after allopathic
Yes,
medicine
yeah,
hospitals. That's the biggest tragedy. We're
yeah.
not producing any more Vedyas. They're so timid. Firstly, they're so timid because
Hmm.
they've been put under
Yes.
the health
Yeah, they are
ministry.
still regarded by many people as quacks. I mean, that's a problem. That
Yeah,
a
this health
lot of them have been
ministry.
discredited in international fora. I mean, if you look at Wikipedia, they will still tell you that a lot of Ayurveda is basically Quakery or whatever. It's not scientifically demonstrated, and we don't understand the principles they use. They are not scientific principles. This whole campaign of disinformation is going on, basically. Which
Well,
is
then,
very is a great pity.
uh, Forty will take care of such mad people. I have no problem. So long as he keeps away from India. Bill Gates can take care of the crazies who think Ayurveda is quackery. Then they can have all their fun with Bill Gates and his prescriptions. Leave India alone, because we have a much saner attitude towards body and its connection to the world, to nature, and how to keep it healthy. There aren't better systems yet devised anywhere in the world than our ancestors have already put in place. But sadly, we don't get good Vedyas. And they're timid because they've been put under what they call the health ministry, but it's actually allopathic medicine dispensation ministry. There's nothing else healthy about it. It's only about prescribing allopathic medicines. That's all that the health ministry does. Make hospitals that prescribe medicines and procedures which are very often more harmful than helpful. So it's better that Ayurveda be taught the traditional way from traditional gurus, experts who have generations of experiential wisdom, and not through this mass production of very timid youngsters who go to study Ayurveda only and only because they couldn't get admission in MBBS. They think they'll still be called a doctor. So look for Vaidyas, support them, and if nothing else, your grandmother's wisdom, your mother's wisdom will come in more handy than any of these modern newfangled remedies for illnesses that they poorly understand. They don't even understand well. Thank you, viewers, for staying with us. Thank you for, I don't think there are any super chats because I kept on taking comments. And if you have any more questions you want to pass, okay, here's one. Mohit says, your conversation with Maitreyi Goswami is being used by some anti Hindu channels to encourage Hindus into leaving Hinduism and conversion blunder. Yes, Mohit, I've had a lot of feedback from both sides. Some thought I was not good enough to deal with her scholarly wisdom, so they trolled me. But the kind of responses I've got from lot of very, very serious scholars of our Vedic scholars, scholars who understand the Shastras and history of their evolution, have written very positively to me about my questions to her. Um, I tried to control the damage as much as I could, but it was not easy because we were really not on the same wavelength. But this issue will be dealt with again and again. See, I don't think the Abrahamics are waiting for Madhu Kishwar's channel to provide them ammunition. They already have garnered so much ammunition and fake narratives against our faith traditions that we don't need to worry about them. We just need to know how to battle them more effectively. So don't worry. Um, that was just the beginning of understanding how not to carry out a conversation on shastric wisdom or Vedic wisdom. We'll do better next. Don't worry. Thank you for warning me. Islamic scholars क्या कह रहे हैं? Defend dawa and jihad. Christian scholars proudly talk about evangelism. Hindu scholar cannot defend Varna system logically. True, Mohit. But don't worry. एक बार हो गई गलती, कोई बात नहीं. अभी आप देखिए ना, अभी हम मरे तो नहीं जा रहे हैं, अभी बहुत कुछ करेंगे. और आप जो जो कह रहे हैं ना, इसको बुलाओ उसको बुलाओ, नित्यानंद मिश्रा जी को, ये सभी को बुलाएंगे. बहुत से लोग हैं आज. वी आर लकी, वी हैव मेनी पीपल who are able to defend these issues and explain these issues more rationally and with greater command. So I know your concern, I appreciate it, but rest assured, we'll handle this mishap uh, effectively in the coming months. Okay, viewers, thank you, Com. Always a pleasure listening to you. You still have to talk to me about a couple of issues, a couple of ongoing madnesses in the West, especially sex change
Yes.
uh, disease. You know, this disease of training children and encouraging them to demand sex change if they so desire. I mean, it's so manipulative. I can't believe it. But we're going to have that show another time soon. Thank you very much. और viewers, आप भी अपना थोड़ा बहुत कर्तव्य निभाइए. कृपया शेयर कीजिए, लाइक कीजिए, सपोर्ट कीजिए और कमेंट कीजिए. तो जुड़े रहे हमारे साथ. और मानुषी को ग्रो करने की जिम्मेदारी थोड़ी बहुत तो आपको हर एक को लेनी पड़ेगी. इन्हीं शब्दों के साथ शुभ रात्रि. वंदे मातरम.
Shubhratri.
शुभ रात्रि.